Hi, I'm Mark from Valor Excel. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I'd like to welcome you to the next installment in our series called Small Business Success Strategies. And today we'd like to talk about process mapping. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you know that at the end of each episode, I normally offer a fantastic free resource we have called Taking Your Organization's Temperature. Today I'd like to do that at the beginning of the episode rather than the end, because I'd like to cite two specific references from that document. So if you click on the link in the description below this video, you can download Taking Your Organization's Temperature. This PDF consists of 30 statements that really just describe different facets of how you do business. If you go through, there are possible responses that you can provide for each one of those statements. You decide which one fits best for your organization. There's a corresponding numeric value for each one of them, and when you tally it up at the end, it will tell you what kind of an approach you take. Are you inactive? Do you just sit back and wait for things to happen? Are you reactive? Do you make adjustments in your organization only when some outside catalyst causes you to do so? Or are you proactive? Are you always thinking ahead, looking forward, and planning? That's the one you definitely want to fall into. But go ahead, download it, go through it and see how it applies to you. And I want to specifically touch on two of the statements from that document that are really going to be the primary core of what we talk about today. Now, process mapping is something that people, I think, sometimes either overlook altogether because it's so obvious they just dismiss it, or they kind of downplay the importance of it. They might think it's silly, it's redundant, it's something they don't really need to do. But process mapping is one of the most important things that you can do in your small business or your nonprofit, because the only way you can really function efficiently is if you've documented how you do everything that you do. So today I'm going to share with you 5 key points of process mapping, benefits that you will automatically reap if you decide to take that approach. And I'll talk about 2 different kinds of process mapping. They each have their own uses, they each play their own role, but they function a little bit differently. Now, process mapping is something that really is a wide spectrum. You can use sophisticated software to do it. You can utilize something like Microsoft PowerPoint or Word. It doesn't really matter what tools you're using. The idea behind all of it is that you want to be able to put in some sort of a fixed form how you do what you do. You carry out business every day, and if you're not really intentional about documenting it, you're opening yourself up to a whole world of problems at a lot of different complexities. And so today I'll share the 5 benefits that come when you do take an intentional approach and really commit yourself to documenting how you do what you do. Now, really, process mapping tends to fall into one of 2 different things. And I'll go back and cite that Taking Your Organization's Temperature, because I'd like to talk about the first one, which is actually item number 9 from Taking Your Organization's Temperature. And here's what it says. Detailed documentation exists to explain the step-by-step process for each function performed within each position, and the documentation is easily accessible by staff. Now, what that means is you can't simply write a bare bones job description and feel like that's really covering the bases. You need to make sure that everything that is associated with that position is properly documented. That means taking the time to really figure out the nuts and bolts of what's required to carry out that job function each day. And there may be many different components to doing that job. You need to make sure that there's proper documentation for each one of them. And the whole idea of accessibility is you always want to make sure that whatever you document is there for whoever in your organization needs to have access to it. Things shouldn't be hidden. It shouldn't be a wild goose chase trying to get the right answer. And the great thing with documentation is it eliminates the need for someone to go and ask a question from someone else. Now, there should always be the opportunity to do that, but that shouldn't be where you start. Ideally, people should have such good reference materials that 95% of the time they can get their questions answered simply by reading what you have intentionally written. And that's really where the statement we just looked at from Taking Your Organization's Temperature comes into play. And here we're talking specifically about writing procedures, where you might have step-by-step documentation describing in detail how to carry out each function of a job. Now, it can sometimes seem like you're going into overkill mode, but you can't take anything for granted when you're documenting processes. Because again, someone who does that job by rote thousands of times every month, carrying different functions out, going through all these different maneuvers, it's second nature to them. But to someone brand new, or to someone who's trying to get an understanding of what's entailed in that job function, they really do need the minutiae, all the little pieces that go together to make that job happen. Now, the other type of process mapping that I'd like to take a look at is also referenced by one of the items from taking your organization's temperature, and this is number 11. And here's what that says. Process flowcharts are created and maintained in conjunction with written processes to serve as a visual representation of the steps for each task. Now, flowcharts can seem kind of archaic. They really go back to the early days of computing, and in many respects, they've kind of fallen by the wayside. But I think a flowchart, simple as it might be, is a fantastic way to get a snapshot of a process. And it functions a little bit differently than just written step-by-step instructions. If you write things out, that's more of a technical manual. But when you put something in a flowchart, you're opening up this tremendous opportunity for people to really see how the pieces of a process connect. And it's very visual. And especially if you can contain all the elements of what you're depicting into a single slide, then you really do have a snapshot. You have an overview of that entire process. You can see what it is that causes the process to start. What are the factors that would trigger an employee taking the steps we're describing? You can go through each one of them. If there's a situation where you have to make a decision, you can indicate what the decision is based on, and depending on what that decision is, which different course of action you would follow. And the other great thing with a flowchart is that it tends to be very cyclical rather than linear. And so you really are seeing the complete process. You're seeing what is the catalyst to get the process going, how is it ultimately resolved, and that really sets you up for repeatability. That's one of the greatest benefits of documenting your processes, is so that you can always repeat them the same way. So I really encourage you to look at both of those components from taking your organization's temperature, and they really do function in slightly different ways, but very much in tandem. I would always start off with detailed written step-by-step instructions that really cover every single piece of information you need to communicate, but don't neglect flowcharts because, again, it provides a great capsule summary of what you're doing. So today I'd like to share with you 5 benefits that you will automatically gain if you decide to be intentional about process mapping in your organization. Number 1, if someone leaves, their knowledge doesn't. You'll hear me talk about this a lot because it's a pet peeve of mine. I'm so frustrated when I see particularly a small business that doesn't have that many staff to begin with, very, very dependent on each one of those people really knowing how to do their jobs. Now, on the surface, that seems okay, but the reality is you can never build your business on the people who work for you, because at some point they might not be there. You have to build everything in your organization on the knowledge that those people possess, and that's where process mapping is so critical. That way, if somebody leaves unexpectedly, if there's some sudden situation that no one could anticipate, you haven't lost that knowledge. You have a tremendous framework distilled from the experience of whoever was doing those particular job functions for a new person to learn from. It can really save your organization not just headaches, but sometimes catastrophic circumstances. If a critical staff member suddenly leaves, you really could find your operations crippled. Even bare bones documentation is better than nothing, but I encourage you to be as detailed as you can, and you will avoid any negative circumstances should someone leave. Number 2, documentation guarantees consistency. A couple of minutes ago, I talked about the idea of repeatability. Consistency in your organization is one of the most important steps you can take toward building your own credibility. If you do something one way on Tuesday and a different way on Friday, you'll always look foolish and you'll never be able to really be efficient or effective, and certainly you'll never be able to develop as an organization. The most important thing to focus on is defining your processes so clearly that you know you're always doing them consistently. It also has the benefit of eliminating personal interpretation, which can be a gray area at best and extremely problematic if it happens to slip a little bit into someone really trying to infuse their own personality and their own choices into how something is carried out. So the idea of being able to do things in a way that is easy to maintain will build a tremendous momentum for your organization if you take the time to document everything properly. Number 3, process mapping streamlines training. Now, this can be true across the board. Maybe you're introducing some new process, even to tenured staff who've been with the company for years. It's a lot easier if they have really good reference materials. If you just expect people to sit through a lecture for 20 minutes and then hope that they'll go off and do the job correctly, it probably won't work out very well. But if they have something in hand that they can refer back to, you're giving them powerful tools toward doing that job correctly. And it's also helpful if you are perhaps a nonprofit. Maybe you utilize volunteers or interns where you have an influx of new people who come and go. It can be really daunting if you're trying to train people in especially complex job processes over and over and over again, always trying to communicate that information to a new set of people. When you have great reference materials, it'll make the job easier for whoever your trainer is, and it will again crystallize how that process really needs to function, which will make it much easier for new people to understand. Number 4, putting processes in writing reveals deficiencies. Again, one of the deceptive things about the processes in our organizations is that we're good at them. We do them so much, they do become second nature. We don't really have to stop and think about what's happening. And so there tends to be an intellectual disconnect. We kind of get in the routine to the point that we're no longer analyzing the efficiency of what it is that we're doing. But when you put things in a written form, it really puts a gigantic microscope over your entire organization. And now you're looking down through this highly focused lens, and you can begin to see if there are little deficiencies, holes and gaps, parts of processes that maybe are redundant, that unintentionally bring a couple of people in to do the same thing for no good reason, or situations where some critical piece of information is overlooked because people just intuitively know that that's part of the job function, but it's never really been written down. That's why when you develop process mapping, it's great to involve the people who actually do that work day in and day out so that they'll be able to identify quickly and easily if something has been overlooked. And my personal favorite, number 5, procedures in flowchart form give perspective for outsiders. Now, we talked a couple of minutes ago about a written procedural manual, and if somebody came into your organization from the outside and was asking about how a particular job was done, would you hand them a 75-page step-by-step procedure manual and expect them to read it? They might slog through a couple of pages, but they would probably wind up confused and frustrated, and they'd start to shut down and not really feel like their question ever got answered. But hand that same person a single PowerPoint slide that has a tightly constructed, concise flowchart describing the steps of that process, and it's a whole different world. Now they have that snapshot, that capsule summary, and the visual representation of the job function can make a lot more sense to them. This can be really beneficial if you're a nonprofit and you're courting outside funding sources, perhaps for a grant or a donation. They may want to know why it takes 3 people to do a particular job, or why you're asking for additional funding for some element of your process. That's where flowcharts really shine, because even someone who knows nothing about how your organization works can get a pretty good understanding just looking at those flowchart steps. So as you can see, process mapping really is a critical component in the success of your organization. So I really encourage you, please don't overlook it. It's something that no one enjoys doing. It can be time consuming. It can be a bit of a pain sometimes, but it's really worth investing in because you not only streamline your own processes and let your trainings run much more smoothly, but you enable yourself to be in a position of communicating how you do what you do to someone outside of your organization. I really appreciate you joining me today. And if this was beneficial for you, would you please give this video a like? And in the comments below, let me know if you use process mapping in your organization. And if you do you use flowcharts? Do you do something in a completely digital context? Do you use paperwork? Do you have written procedural manuals, or do you have a hybrid? I'd be really interested to know. I also invite you to subscribe to the Valor Excel channel. We have new content on a regular basis, and all of it is specifically geared to help nonprofits and small businesses to truly thrive. I really do appreciate you joining me today. I invite you to come back next time. Remember, at Valor Excel, everything we do is specifically geared toward helping you to do smart work. Thanks again. I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.